Alright, so this is Jason Horsley. I'm back from my hiatus from the internet and I'm going to do a YouTube video. Ostensibly, I hope to focus on Prisoner of Infinity, UFOs, Social Engineering and the Psychology of Fragmentation, since that book will be out on April Fool's Day, Easter Sunday, and of course I want to draw attention to that fact. The main theme of Prisoner of Infinity and my interest that was sparked, that led to the book, that of traumagenesis, the belief and the practice of attempting to use trauma, administered trauma, to create psychic states, heightened awareness, as a surrogate for enlightenment. That's essentially the thesis of the book that ties into many different areas such as transhumanism, the space colonization, dream, and of course alien abduction, and the whole UFO problem and MKULTRA. Okay, so I'm talking about Prisoner of Infinity. It's a very far-reaching thesis, and it's difficult to sum up. So I'm going to attempt to do so, create the context for couching the whole thesis within as scientism. And I'm going to begin with a specific article, which is a very little known work called Changing Images of Man, which the researcher Jeff Wells referred to as perhaps the most important book almost no one has read. And indeed, when I did a search for it just now online, Google, I saw that my own blog, Horticulture, was the fourth in the search results, just for Changing Images of Man alone. So that's pretty remarkable that it's so little known or talked about, considering. Anyway, so Changing Images of Man was prepared by the Stanford Research Institute Center for the Study of Social Policy. It was edited by Willis Harman and O.W. Markley. Harman is one of the central characters of Prisoner of Infinity. Pops up anyway a lot. He was the president of Edgar Mitchell's Institute of Noetic Sciences, and among other things, which we'll get to. The Changing Images of Man had 8 authors listed at the start. One of whom is Joseph Campbell. It also had a panel of supervisors, quite a large list. I think there's 23 of them all. It includes Margaret Mead, the anthropologist, who I talk about in The Vice of Kings as a sort of forerunner to Kinsey, in terms of introducing the fallacy of child sexuality and sexual freedom. B.F. Skinner, who created the Skinner box, similar to what Whitley Strieber was subjected to. Irvin Laszlo of the UN, Sir Geoffrey Vickers of British Intelligence, and John White of the Institute of Noetic Science again. The aim of the study, the authors state, is to change the image of mankind from that of industrial progress to one of spiritualism. One of the things that has led me to want to put my attention back on the Changing Images of Man document, besides it being central to the Prisoner of Infinity thesis, is certain parallels with the Jordan Peterson project Maps of Meaning, which is not actually as well known as Peterson himself, very far from it. Peterson has become a cultural media phenomenon in the last year or so, and has just had this massive bestseller, which is prescriptive book 12 Rules for Life, telling people how to live, based on his research and investigations and writings around maps of meaning and his various lectures over the last 2 decades. But most people who criticize Peterson are not familiar with the maps of meaning material at all. Anyway, mention that in passing because my focus has been on Peterson lately, and it now seems to be converging with the Prisoner of Infinity thesis in unexpected ways. These are questions that I've been addressing for some time, that Jordan Peterson is raising, and he's getting the questions right, but he's getting the answers, I would say, quite seriously wrong. And so that's kind of the perfect combination, really, because if he was asking the wrong questions, well, I wouldn't be any interest in paying attention at all. And if he was asking the right questions and getting the answers right, there wouldn't really be much to contribute there. But as is, yeah, it's like it is opening up, or rather, something is opening up in the newest sphere, and Jordan Peterson is sort of the nub of it, or the hub of it, and the most visible point of emergence of this new receptivity to large ethical questions as to our purpose in creation. So bring it back to Willis Harman. Harman worked with Al Hubbard of the OSS, the CIA, at the SRI, which received grants from the US Army to research chemical incapacitance. This would have been back in the 50s, I imagine, or 60s. This is around the LSD thing. I'm just reading from my notes here. Hubbard was specifically assigned to the Alternative Futures Project, which performed future-oriented strategic planning for corporations and government agencies. Harman and Hubbard shared a goal to provide the LSD experience to political and intellectual leaders around the world. The other co-editor of Changing Images of Man was O.W. Markley, who wrote a paper called Visionary Futures that outlined some of other SRI alternative methodologies, including channel material in the book Seth Speaks by Jane Roberts. Willis believed humanity is embarking on a period of global mind change, and that people could reorder the world by deliberately changing their internal image of reality, hence the title and concept, Changing Images of Man. So the basic goal of Changing Images of Man was to introduce or reintroduce image of man that would lay the groundwork for a changing paradigm, a changing ethical structure by which to perceive reality, using Jordan Peterson's terms, and thereby implementing new social changes, social adaptations, cultural revivification, and social stabilization, which is Jordan Peterson's avowed aim. So continuing reading here, whether it's psychic phenomena, mystical experiences, communications with the dead, this is Willis Harman, whatever it is, you're implying that reality is different from the way they taught you in school. Sooner or later we're going to say, well, if all of that's so, then our emphases in business and economics have to be different, as well as our emphases in politics, education, and healthcare. Reactivating the American symbols, reinterpreting the work ethic, supporting the basic concepts of a free enterprise democratic society, and providing new meaning for the technological industrial thrust was the aim of Changing Images of Man. Bringing it back to Joseph Campbell, one of the 8 listed authors of Changing Images of Man. Campbell, of course, was very famous for reintroducing myths, ancient myths, to the mainstream, and specifically for inspiring George Lucas, whom he had some sort of relationship, personal, direct relationship with, and creating the Star Wars myth, which fuses science with mysticism, which is bringing us full circle to scientism, or rather setting up what I want to talk about, scientism. But in passing, I also mentioned that I was listening just yesterday to this guy, John David Ebert, who has a series of YouTube videos about Jordan Peterson's maps of meaning, and he described maps of meaning as a left brain rewrite of Campbell's The Hero with a Thousand Faces. So, but yeah, overarching objective here is just to introduce the idea of scientism, because it's a word that isn't used very often, and therefore is not very well understood. One simple way of understanding the word scientism, I think, is science expanded outward to the point that it becomes similar to a form of superstition. Science as superstition. So this bias is towards consensual agreement, which is to say, like an external reality that is confirming and validating our own experience and our own felt sense of truth, as compared to the more religious point of view, which is divine revelation, a direct encounter with reality. When the scientific method is put forward as the best and only truly reliable means to truth, then it becomes scientism, and the shared bias then is towards intellectual knowing. And I think that's what Changing Images Man is about. I think it's what occultism is about in its way, and the New Age movement. And I think it's kind of what our course as human beings in history has been about in a large manner, is trying to reformat religious experience and belief in a more and more secular way, more and more humanized, so that it becomes more and more adaptable to our own personal ego desires, which is kind of like it becomes the counterfeit and the inversion of the true image of God. Scientism is, okay, the belief that science can address and eventually solve all problems, starting and ending with the problem of knowing true objective reality. That's the basic premise of atheists, scientifically minded people, rationalists, and so on, that we can understand the infinite through our rational faculties, one way or another. And that is in and of itself a contradiction. Actually, it's there in the terms, the words themselves, because to ration implies to break things up into parts, and the infinite by definition can't be broken up. It's infinite. You can't actually, you can't have half an infinite. Yeah, so the idea that the present is superior to the past and the future will be superior to the present, that we're advancing, we're gaining in knowledge and understanding through human progress, that evolution can be transposed, this idea, whether it's true or not, onto social progress and even spiritual progress. This is actually the reverse of the religious belief, once again, which is the fall. The beginning of history was coincident with our casting out the Garden of Eden. Alright, so that was my introduction. It's much longer than I wanted it to be, to Prisoner of Infinity, which I hope will show in a much more specific fashion the error of scientism, and how by attempting to reduce the infinite to something that we can actually map and find meaning in, we become prisoners of it.
You said, I think, has contributed to the modern conception of what a gray is. Yeah.
First of all, we have Jeffrey Kripal, and I can't remember why, what the context. He sent me his essay, The Traumatic Secret, about Georges Bataille, and part of the thesis of that essay was that trauma can induce states of consciousness that are akin to enlightened states that the saints and shamans and other figures throughout history have experienced. And I questioned his thesis, and the essay refers to Whitley Strieber as the last example, and it also refers to, sort of metaphorically, the Hadron Collider at CERN and the scientific method of smashing particles together in order to release the energy within them and discover the truth about physical reality. And Kripal uses this as a metaphor for how extreme violence is necessary, or at least a method for getting to the truth of existence, of being, and of consciousness. And I fundamentally disagree with this thesis. I think that there is definitely something to be questioned about the extent to which the means by which we access or attain truth distort the evidence that we then interpret to be truth. So this is essentially what I think about Kripal's thesis about enlightenment through trauma. That, well, there's two things. Maybe it's just one thing, but if you induce a state of consciousness that has some similarities to enlightenment, not that we know what that is, but it's so radically different from a normal state of consciousness that it can be presented as enlightenment, then is it worth the cost, is the first question. But I think that's inseparable from the second, more important one, which is it really enlightenment? And the answer is that no, it's not. It's a surrogate for enlightenment that has been brought about, induced through trauma via the psychological defense mechanism of dissociation. Now, the psychological defense mechanism of dissociation is little understood as it is by psychology, let alone by science. And what Kripal's presenting in terms of Strieber's case is that via the dissociation caused by trauma, Strieber, and in his own terms, he shattered the mirror of expectation, as in his mental, culturally conditioned mental framework by which he accessed, interpreted, and experienced reality. That was shattered, and therefore he was able to access aspects of reality that normally are not perceptible to us. This overlaps with Peterson's whole project, which has to do with what ethic structures your perception, namely that the beliefs we have, the moral values, and so on, determine our behavior, not simply because we follow them like doctrines, but because they actually determine the configuration of our perceptual filters by which we determine what is relevant in an infinite sea of information, most of which is rendered irrelevant, the rest of which in Peterson's model is rendered as either tools or obstacles. In other words, put in the context of a goal that itself is determined by our ethics. So it's a very good model, I think, even though it's very limited, or at least the way that Peterson applies it is very limited, I would say. So Strieber's point is that, well, within that context, like his ethical framework was shattered through childhood trauma violation at the hands of MKULTRA-like Nazi doctors. Well, Strieber himself denies, at least to me, any evidence that he was part of MKULTRA. I guess generally if something has feathers and it clucks and lays eggs, we assume it's a chicken, and so I have assumed that he's referring to MKULTRA because of the period, the location, the nature of the experiments, and the known parties involved. Basically, you've got Nazis traumatizing children in order to tap into the psychic potential somewhere in Texas in the early 50s. That sounds like MKULTRA to me. But anyway,
34 scientists accepted contracts from Project Paperclip and were moved to Randolph Air Force Base in San Antonio, Texas. The authorization to hire these Nazi scientists came directly from the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
San Antonio, Texas. NBC News has also learned that the CIA paid for a study of adolescence here and in two other Texas cities, Austin and El Paso, in 1958 and 1959. It was a study of how youngsters behave without adult supervision. This study, MKULTRA Subproject 102, refers to data being collected on 462 subjects in 7 secondary schools. No child is identified by name.
Regardless of the actual name of the program that Strieber was allegedly inducted into at a very young age, the goal of it, well, the goal of it is harder to say, but the result of it, according to Strieber, was that he had his mirror of expectation shattered, his ethical framework for perceiving reality, and to the visitors. They whisked him away, they rescued him through some sort of psychic intervention, which is indistinguishable from dissociation in psychological terms, to another realm of being, and that's what interests Kripal. What I'm questioning is that there's a relation between psychic potential and enlightenment. And in fact, this is, in a certain sense, a larger thesis. I guess it's a twin thesis. And there's certainly a lot more I don't know if evidence is the word, but testimony. I mean, there's a body of belief that supports me in this thesis. It is generally recognized, I would say, by the more rigorous spiritual and religious disciplines that psychic potential has very little to do with enlightenment, and insofar as it does relate to it, it's generally either an obstacle to it or a side effect on the way to it. And of course, those two things aren't mutually exclusive. If it is a side effect on the way to enlightenment, it can become an obstacle insofar as we mistake the finger for the moon, the map for the territory. Kripal's purpose, I think, as an academic at Rice University and the Institute of Noetic Sciences, both, it's not really an academic thing, the institute, but is to reformulate, on the one hand, ideas about religion and spirituality in a more secular modern context, just like Jordan Peterson, and specifically in the context of trauma, which I think rather dangerously, or very dangerously, makes religious states, religious experiences inducible, which I think is a bad idea to begin with, but then inducible through trauma, then it becomes not just a bad idea, but a quite malign one, a potentially really dangerous one. And that is an interesting parallel with Peterson, because I would say the biggest red flag about Peterson thus far, I mean the most incontrovertible, is his constant lip service to psychedelics as means to induce religious vision or mystical states. This is an absolute error, I would say, in making that correlation total, if you will. There may be some correlation, but it's certainly not 100%. And even to make them equivalent at all, even on one occasion, let's say, that psychedelics could lead to a 100% authentic experience of divine revelation, renders God or the divine obsolete, or reduces it to a chemical process in the brain, I would say. I mean, one could stretch that, I suppose, or span it, bridge it, by saying that God moves in the plants, and the plants are inhabited by divine spirits, and there certainly is some truth in that. I don't think divine is the right term here. I think more like demonic spirits. Anyway, okay, so yes, Kripal on the one hand is promoting or recontextualizing religious experience in this secular context of trauma and other things, other factors, not just trauma. And on the other hand, he seems to be working quite hard towards the end of legitimizing Whitley Strieber and, by association, the whole alien abduction paradigm. I don't know how effective he's been, because, well, there doesn't seem much evidence that academia as a whole is paying much attention to him or Whitley Strieber, and his work seems to be more useful for validating the New Age and to some extent the occultic sort of neo-shamanic Burning Man kind of framework. Okay, thanks for listening. Like the video, comment, tell me what you think, and if you like it, share it and let other people know about what's going on.
A skillfully designed lie created to mislead you. Now, here's what happened to me. And when it happened, I was just exactly where most people are to this day. I would have scoffed at anybody who talked about Close Encounters of the Third Kind as anything except fiction.